On the afternoon of December 20th, 1941, at exactly 4 o'clock, the air above Kunming did not resemble a combat zone. It felt like a city holding its breath before a burial. 10 Japanese bombers cruised calmly at 6,000 feet, spaced neatly, confident in their immunity. They did not weave. They did not skim behind them. They flew as if on parade, engines droning in a steady, almost lazy rhythm that rattled windows and nerves in the streets below. For 4 long years, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force had ruled Chinese skies without consequence. Cities had been bombed into rubble. Refugees had been strafed along open roads. The Chinese Air Force had been reduced to wreckage and smoke. Not once had a full Japanese formation been wiped out. Not once had they truly been tested. The bomber crews had been assured that Americans would never risk real combat. They had been told the Chinese were already beaten. They believed the sky belonged to the emperor. They were mistaken. Above them, concealed in the glare of the afternoon sun, something waited. It was not polished aluminum or elegant in shape. It was a dull olive machine, rough and practical, as if assembled in a farm equipment plant. A Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk. Inside the cockpit sat Jack Newkirk, once a Navy pilot, now sweating through his suit in thick tropical heat. The control stick trembled violently in his grip. He was not even supposed to be there. Officially, the United States was not yet at war with Japan. Newkirk was flying as a paid volunteer, a man who had walked away from security for money and a restless urge to test himself. He studied the bombers below. Then he glanced at the bulky fighter wrapped around him. He remembered the warning from the hard-faced old commander who had trained them. Fight the Japanese on equal terms, and you die. Newkirk shoved the nose down. He did not roll into a graceful attack. He simply dropped. The P-40 plunged straight toward the formation, howling as it accelerated, falling like a vault kicked off a rooftop. To understand how reckless that decision was, you have to understand the airplane. The P-40 Warhawk, known in its early form as the Tomahawk, was not admired in 1941. Aviation technology was evolving so quickly that designs aged in months. The P-40 already felt outdated. It was built around the Allison V-17-10 engine, liquid-cooled, sturdy, dependable, and nearly powerless at altitude. Once above 15,000 feet, the engine struggled for oxygen like a heavy smoker sprinting uphill. Performance dropped sharply. Climb rate faded. Controls felt heavy. Elsewhere, British pilots flew Spitfires that seemed to float and twist through the sky. German Messerschmitt 109s shot upward like missiles. American units, by comparison, were saddled with a fighter that critics described as flying like masonry. Officials in Washington were unimpressed. Army Air Corps commanders studied the numbers and dismissed it. They labeled it average at best. Too much weight, too little speed. A turning circle so wide it felt absurd. When the Royal Air Force received its first batch, enthusiasm was minimal. The British declined to commit them to European combat against Germany. Instead, they shipped them to North Africa, far from the critical front. The aircraft became a secondary assignment, a place for surplus machines and pilots without better options. So when a former Army captain named Claire Chennault requested fighters to build a volunteer force in China, he did not receive cutting-edge equipment. He received P-40s. The logic in Washington was simple. If those airplanes were going to be lost, better to lose the ones nobody wanted. And then there was the opposition. If the P-40 resembled a delivery truck, the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 resembled a blade forged for combat. It was refined, stripped to essentials. Designers removed armor protection for the pilot. They eliminated self-sealing fuel tanks. They relied on a lightweight aluminum alloy that balanced strength and minimal mass. The result was extraordinary. The Zero could pivot almost instantly. It climbed steeply, almost vertically. It could remain airborne for extended periods without refueling. In a close engagement, it could outturn nearly anything Allied pilots flew. It was agile and elusive. Reports from China describing its performance were initially dismissed by American intelligence. Some officers insisted such capability was exaggerated. They found it difficult to accept that Japanese engineering could surpass Western designs. That skepticism ended when Zeros began destroying American aircraft across the Pacific. The reality was harsh. If a P-40 attempted to match a Zero in a turning fight, the Zero would slip onto its tail within seconds. If the American pilot tried to climb, the Japanese fighter would follow and overtake before cloud cover offered protection. Standard doctrine emphasized tight maneuvering, turning inside the enemy to gain position. Against the Zero, that doctrine was fatal. Manuals instructed pilots to engage aggressively and exploit maneuverability. The P-40 offered little of it. So in dim bars across Rangoon and Kunming, pilots worked through the numbers themselves. They were flying a heavy, outdated machine against something that felt futuristic. They were outnumbered 10-1, and their leader was a man the Army had once forced out. Claire Lee Chennault was never comfortable playing the polished officer. He ignored dress standards, skipped the social rituals, and had no patience for ceremony. His face looked weathered and dry, like cured tobacco left in the sun, and his temperament matched it. He smoked constantly, drank hard, and argued harder. Strategically, he was sharp. Politically, he was a problem. Throughout the 1930s, while the United States Army fixated on heavy bombers, Chennault kept insisting they were wrong. Senior commanders repeated the same line: the bomber will always get through. Fighters, in their view, were leftovers from the First World War, useful for air shows but irrelevant in modern strategy. Chennault pushed back. He published a book titled Defensive Pursuit, laying out how properly coordinated fighter tactics could stop bombers cold. The reaction inside the Army was hostile. They disliked his arguments. They disliked his blunt delivery. They disliked that his conclusions made sense. By 1937, the Army encouraged him to step aside. Officially, they cited hearing problems. Unofficially, everyone understood he had become inconvenient. So he left and headed to China. There he witnessed the Japanese air campaign firsthand. He watched Mitsubishi Zeros slicing through outdated Chinese biplanes with ease. He did not look at it emotionally. He studied it clinically, like a scientist observing a predator. He examined their formations, their attack patterns, their climb angles. And he noticed what others had missed. The Zero's strength came at a price. It was built light, almost delicate. Armor was removed to save weight. Fuel tanks were not self-sealing. The aircraft could maneuver beautifully, but it could not absorb punishment. A concentrated burst from heavy machine guns would ignite it instantly. Then he reconsidered the P-40. Most pilots saw its weight as a flaw. In fighter culture, being heavy meant being inferior. Chennault saw something else. Physics did not care about pride. A heavier airplane, once pointed downward, gathered speed aggressively. If a P-40 dove with full power, it did not glide. It accelerated violently. Few aircraft could match it in a steep descent. That was the advantage. Chennault began building his force. He did not recruit polished academy graduates looking for ceremony. He searched American bases for restless, frustrated men. Some were bored. Some needed money. Some needed a second chance. He offered $600 a month, an enormous salary in 1941, plus $500 for every Japanese aircraft shot down. The incentive worked. The group he assembled was uneven. There were Texas farm boys, wealthy university graduates, drifters chasing adrenaline. He transported them to a deteriorating field carved into jungle terrain in Burma. Conditions were primitive. The runway turned to mud. Barracks were simple bamboo huts swarming with insects. The heat pressed down constantly. They had no radar coverage. Spare parts were scarce. If a fuel pump failed, mechanics scavenged one from wreckage or improvised something crude to replace it. Training was blunt and unforgiving. In a stifling tent, Chennault tossed the official Army flight manual onto the dirt and told them plainly that standard doctrine would get them killed. He was clear about one rule: never turn with a Zero. Smoke drifted around him as he explained. Attack from altitude. Dive fast. Fire once. Then continue diving away. He called it the divergence method. The pilots shortened it to boom and zoom. The concept was simple. The P-40 was not a fencing blade. It was a weighted hammer. Start above the enemy. Spot your target. Roll inverted. Drop. Gravity would do the rest. The fighter would surge downward at 400 miles per hour, faster than a Zero could safely pursue. As the aircraft passed through firing range, its heavy machine guns would tear into the lightly protected Japanese plane. Then, without circling, the pilot would use accumulated speed to climb sharply back to altitude, resetting for another strike. Many of the young flyers disliked the approach. They imagined aerial combat as a contest of skill, turning tightly and outmaneuvering opponents. Chennault was asking them to avoid duels entirely. He told them not to fight like swordsmen. He told them to strike and withdraw, to behave like hunters, not champions in a ring. They looked at their thick, awkward P-40s parked in mud. They read intelligence reports praising the agility of the Zero. Then they listened to an aging officer who coughed often and heard poorly in one ear. They had to choose what to believe: textbooks promising glory or a dismissed captain offering survival. Then someone began painting. It started casually. A pilot had seen an image of a P-40 in North Africa decorated with a shark mouth on the nose. The design was crude but aggressive. Life in Burma left them with idle hours and spare paint. They copied the idea. They added sharp white teeth along the engine cowling. They painted fierce eyes near the nose. A red tongue stretched beneath the propeller. The effect was dramatic. The large air intake under the P-40's propeller already resembled an open mouth. With teeth added, the aircraft no longer looked clumsy. It looked predatory. Back in the United States, some critics dismissed the artwork as childish. They argued that paint did not improve speed or climb rate. They insisted disciplined Japanese aviators would not fear a cartoon grin. They missed the point. When you are strapped into a heavy fighter facing an opponent who has never been defeated, belief matters. The paint was not for the enemy. It was for the pilot. It turned an awkward machine into something fierce in the mind of the man flying it. Soon, Japanese crews would glance backward and see those teeth closing in. The breakthrough was not mechanical. It was gravitational. In a sweltering briefing tent in Burma, Chennault reduced combat to energy. Victory was not about tighter turns. It was about who controlled altitude and speed. On a chalkboard, he sketched arcs and plunges that resembled the track of a roller coaster more than a traditional engagement plan. Chennault laid it out in plain numbers. A fully armed and fueled P-40 weighed close to 9,000 pounds. In a climb, that mass was punishment. The engine strained. The nose resisted lifting. Pilots felt the drag in their shoulders and in the sweat running down their backs. But tip the aircraft forward, and that same weight turned into an asset. Point the nose toward the jungle, and gravity joined the fight. The mass that had slowed the climb now pulled the fighter downward with brutal efficiency. It accelerated like a bank vault dropped from a rooftop. Japanese Zeros and Nadies were the opposite. They were built light, almost delicate, more like gliders wrapped in thin metal. They could float, pivot, and dance. What they could not do was fall fast. If a Zero pilot forced a steep dive trying to follow a P-40, air resistance would slam into that lightweight frame. The controls would tremble. The airframe would buffet violently. Push beyond limits, and the wings could fail entirely. Chennault drilled this into his pilots relentlessly. "You have one advantage," he told them. "You are flying a brick. Use it." He prohibited turning contests outright. If he caught anyone trying to outturn a Japanese fighter, he warned he would ground them himself. The plan he demanded was direct and unforgiving. Climb well above the enemy. Stay hidden in the glare of the sun. Then roll inverted and drop. Do not circle. Do not duel. Dive straight through the formation at 400 miles per hour. Fire for a few seconds as you pass. And then leave. That final step offended their instincts. They were fighter pilots raised on legends of aerial nights and one-on-one battles. They wanted to prove skill. Chennault was telling them to strike and withdraw before the enemy could respond. Training runs made it real. To execute the tactic, they had to trust the airplane completely. They aimed the nose downward until treetops filled the windshield. The airspeed needle swept past 300, then 350, then 400 miles per hour. Controls grew stiff. The stick resisted movement as if embedded in stone. The entire structure shuddered under the pressure of air rushing across riveted metal. It felt as if the aircraft might tear itself apart. But the P-40 had been built solidly. It was rugged, almost agricultural in its construction. It did not disintegrate. It simply kept accelerating. While the American volunteers practiced falling, Japanese crews continued to operate with confidence. For years they had bombed Kunming without losing a single aircraft. The city had become a routine target. On the morning of December 20th, 1941, a commander in Hanoi authorized another strike. 10 Kawasaki bombers lifted off carrying heavy bombs bound for China. They did not assign fighter cover. There seemed no reason. The Chinese Air Force had been destroyed. The American volunteers were rumored to be unreliable outsiders flying inferior machines. The bombers cruised in a relaxed V formation at 6,000 feet, engines steady, pilots scanning the landscape below. They did not know that 30 miles away, Chinese villagers operating a simple radio warning network had already transmitted a sighting. The message reached the dusty airstrip. A red flare shot upward from the operations tent. This was not practice. Pilots ran. Parachutes were strapped on as ground crews spun inertia starters. Allison engines coughed, spat smoke, and roared awake. One after another, P-40s rolled down the dirt strip, throwing up clouds of red dust before lifting off heavily. They were loaded with fuel and ammunition. Climbing was work. Engines howled at maximum output as the fighters clawed upward, seeking altitude over the incoming bombers. Height meant stored energy. Height meant survival. Jack Newkirk's flight made contact first. 10 dark silhouettes against the cloud layer, steady and organized. The bombers held perfect spacing. They appeared untroubled. Newkirk confirmed his guns were armed. He checked his altitude. 2,000 feet above the formation. Enough. He signaled and pushed the stick forward. The P-40 responded immediately. The nose dropped. The horizon vanished from view, replaced by Earth rushing upward. Speed climbed rapidly. 200, 300, 350. Wind noise shifted from a thin whistle to a deep roar. Vibration traveled through the cockpit floor and up his legs. He was no longer maneuvering. He was descending under gravity's control. Below, the Japanese crews continued scanning horizontally. Their doctrine assumed threats would appear from the side or rear at similar altitude. They did not expect danger from directly above. They did not look into the sun. The first indication was a shadow slicing across a canopy. Then another. An instant later, metal tore apart. The wing of one bomber disintegrated under gunfire. The P-40s punched through the formation like diving hawks. They did not fire from long range. They closed until the bombers filled their sights. 6 heavy machine guns in each American fighter unleashed concentrated bursts. The bombers lacked armor protection. Their fuel tanks were unprotected. When heavy rounds struck, the damage was catastrophic. One bomber erupted into flame immediately, a fireball that forced others to fly through smoke and debris. Another lost power, rolling and plunging toward the rice fields below. Order dissolved. The formation shattered. Shock spread through the Japanese formation. This was not part of the plan. The American fighters were moving too quickly to follow. By the time a rear gunner hauled his turret around, the P-40 had already torn past, diving through the bombers and then climbing hard, using its speed to vault back upward for another strike. And then there was the paint. In the middle of smoke and falling debris, Japanese crews caught glimpses of the attackers' noses. White, jagged teeth. Eyes painted in a permanent glare. It was more than gunfire. It felt like something alive was descending on them. The illusion mattered. In those few chaotic seconds, it looked as if a predator was tearing through their ranks. The surviving bombers reacted instinctively. They jettisoned their loads. Bombs were released not over Kunming, but into open countryside. They needed speed. They needed to escape. The formation broke apart as pilots shoved throttles forward and turned south toward Vietnam. Engines were pushed to their limits. The P-40s were not finished. At the top of their climb, they rolled over again. Another dive. Another burst. One more bomber caught fire. Then another spiraled downward, trailing smoke. The attack became slaughter. Of the 10 aircraft sent to punish Kunming, only a fraction reached home. Those who survived carried a story that unsettled their command. They reported that the Americans did not fight in the expected way. They described a fighter that dropped from the sky at terrifying speed and wore the face of a shark. Back at the Burmese base, the atmosphere was electric. The pilots landed drenched in sweat, hands trembling from adrenaline. They climbed down and embraced ground crews. They pointed to the torn gun tape on their wings, evidence that their guns had fired in real combat. They had validated Chennault's theory. The heavy fighter had not been helpless. The painted mouth was not decoration. It was identity. For the first time in years, Japanese forces had been struck hard in the air and forced to retreat. Kunming was spared. Civilians in the streets celebrated. They began calling the pilots Fei Hu, flying tigers. Chennault did not celebrate. He stood near the operations tent with a cigarette between his fingers, studying the map. He understood the psychology of the enemy. What had happened was not simply a setback for Japan. It was a humiliation. The Imperial Japanese Army did not ignore humiliation. They would not answer with another small raid. They would escalate. Chennault tracked their advance across Southeast Asia. Japanese forces were sweeping through Thailand, pressing toward Burma. Kunming was no longer the only objective. Rangoon was the real prize. Rangoon was the supply artery feeding China. If that port fell, China's resistance would collapse. Japanese planners understood that. Aircraft began concentrating in Thailand. Dozens of bombers. Elite Zero squadrons. Key, 43 fighters, lighter and even more agile. An overwhelming force was assembling. Intelligence reports grew more alarming. Over 200 Japanese aircraft were moving toward the front. The Flying Tigers had fewer than 60 operational P-40s. Fuel stocks were limited. Ammunition was scarce. They had no radar. Any warning would come late. Outnumbered, undersupplied, and isolated, they were expected to fail. In Washington, analysts reviewed the numbers and quietly concluded the unit would be destroyed within weeks. Memoranda predicted complete elimination. One heavy fighter squadron could not withstand an entire air armada. On December 23rd, the warning did not arrive through radio chatter. It came as a vibration. At Mingaladen Airfield near Rangoon, the ground trembled faintly. Pilots looked east. The horizon darkened. It was not weather. Layer after layer of bombers approached, escorted by dense formations of fighters. The sky filled from edge to edge. The shark-mouth fighters would now face the full weight of Japanese air power. This time, the attackers expected the diving tactic. Surprise was gone. Now it would be a direct confrontation. Christmas in Rangoon offered no winter chill. The air was humid and heavy. Clothing clung instantly to skin. On December 25, 1941, the heat rising from Mingaladen's runway did not come from sunlight alone. It radiated from the engines of the remaining serviceable P-40 Tomahawks. Japanese intelligence had chosen the date deliberately. Reports indicated more than 60 bombers, guarded by roughly 30 fighters, heading straight for the city. They were not concealing their movement. They advanced in an immense formation, confident in their numbers. Inside their cockpits, Flying Tiger pilots waited. They were exhausted. Many were ill. Their aircraft bore patches of improvised repairs, metal plates riveted over damage. The air raid siren began its mechanical wail, cutting through jungle noise. There was no hesitation. Throttle levers were pushed forward. On the ground, the P-40 felt awkward and heavy. It bounced over uneven runway surfaces. But once its 1,200 horsepower came alive, it surged forward with force. The squadron accelerated and lifted off as the first bombs began falling toward Rangoon's docks. They climbed urgently. Chennault's instruction echoed in their minds. Altitude meant survival. If caught low and slow beneath Zero fighters, there would be no second chance. The Allison engines were pushed beyond their limits as the pilots forced them past the red line, sacrificing mechanical life for altitude. The fighters clawed upward toward 18,000 feet. The air thinned. Cold crept into the unheated cockpits and settled into their gloves and boots. Then they saw the enemy. The Japanese formation was massive and deliberate, built to intimidate. It stretched across the sky for miles. Bombers held the center in tight, level formation. Above and around them swarmed Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars and Mitsubishi Zeros. These were veteran units. Their pilots had thousands of hours in combat. They trusted their aircraft to outclimb, outturn, and out-accelerate anything the Americans had brought. Watching the P-40 strain for altitude, they likely felt confident. The Japanese fighters peeled away from escort positions and turned to intercept. They anticipated confusion. They expected the Americans to scatter and try to maneuver. Instead, the Flying Tigers did the opposite. They pointed their noses straight at the approaching fighters and advanced head-on. It became a closing contest at nearly 700 miles per hour combined speed. Japanese doctrine emphasized gaining position behind the opponent. You did not charge directly into another aircraft. The Americans did. They understood something critical about their machines. The P-40 carried thick steel armor behind the pilot. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, wrapped to prevent ignition. The frame was strong, heavy, and designed to survive punishment. The Zero had sacrificed all of that for agility. It was light, exposed, and vulnerable. The two forces collided in violent confusion. Tex Hill locked onto a Japanese fighter approaching him. The Zero pilot banked sharply, assuming the American would attempt to follow into a turning fight. Hill did not follow. He fired. 6 .50 caliber machine guns erupted from his wings. The disparity in firepower was dramatic. Japanese fighters carried light 7mm guns. When their rounds struck AP-40, sparks flashed off armor or punched minor holes through skin. When American .50 caliber rounds hit a Zero, destruction was immediate. Hill watched his tracers walk across the wing route of the enemy fighter. There was no gradual damage. The structure failed at once. The wings separated and the aircraft snapped into a violent spin, breaking apart. Hill did not pause to observe. He shoved the nose down into a dive. Gravity pressed him hard into the seat as the jungle rose toward him. A pursuing Zero tried to follow, committing to the dive. Physics intervened. The heavier P-40 accelerated rapidly, building speed far beyond what the lighter Zero could tolerate. The Japanese fighter, built for lift and maneuverability, encountered crushing air resistance. The airframe began to buffet. Controls stiffened. The pilot had to abandon the pursuit or risk structural failure. The P-40 escaped, protected by speed generated through weight and gravity. This was the boom and zoom method executed under pressure. It was not a duel. It was repetition. Climb, dive, fire, withdraw, climb again. The sky over Rangoon dissolved into chaos. Smoke columns rose. Tracer fires stitched across the air. The Japanese formation fragmented. Escort fighters struggled to shield the bombers because the Americans refused to remain engaged. The P-40s dove through, tore at engines and fuel tanks, and then vanished upward before defenders could react. It resembled guerrilla tactics applied to the sky at 300 miles per hour. The shark-mouth fighters appeared everywhere at once. To Japanese bomber crews, it seemed as if the sky itself had grown teeth. Each glance over a shoulder revealed another grinning nose closing rapidly, followed by flashes from 6 heavy guns. The Japanese pilots adjusted quickly. They began concentrating attacks. 2 or 3 fighters would converge on a single P-40, attempting to trap it and force it into a turning engagement. Here the Flying Tigers relied on another advantage: radio coordination. In 1941, many air forces used radios primarily for ground instructions. Pilot-to-pilot chatter during combat was uncommon and often discouraged. Chennault insisted on constant communication. Warnings and instructions flowed continuously. Zero behind you. Brake left. I see him. Hold steady. They operated as a unit rather than as individuals. If a Zero settled onto the tail of a P-40, the American pilot would not attempt risky evasive maneuvers. He would maintain course and call for assistance. Another P-40, positioned higher, would dive into the engagement. The pursuing Zero, focused on its prey, often failed to notice the second fighter descending until it was too late. One of the harshest exchanges occurred when Duke Hedman found himself isolated against a bomber group. He lacked altitude and speed. What he had was determination. He attacked from below, an unexpected angle. His guns tore into the underside of the lead bomber. The aircraft shuddered and dropped from formation, its bomb load detonating after impact in the jungle below. Hedman continued upward, forcing his P-40 to the edge of a stall to line up the next target. The fighter hung briefly in unstable air, vibrating as he fired. A second bomber ignited. Then a third. The action ignored standard procedure. It relied on precision and nerve. Hedman eventually returned with empty ammunition belts and fuel nearly exhausted. In a single day, he had achieved A status. The battle persisted for nearly an hour. Smoke streaked the sky. Black trails from burning oil mixed with white vapor from ruptured cooling systems. Fragments fell toward the rice paddies below, sections of wings, engine covers, drifting parachutes. The sound was overwhelming. Engines howling, guns hammering, metal tearing itself apart. Then, almost abruptly, the sky emptied. The Japanese had reached their limit. What remained of the attacking force turned south toward Thailand. Bombs had been released, but most had fallen wide of their intended targets. The docks still stood. The airfield remained usable. The advance that had rolled across Asia had just slammed into resistance. When the P-40s staggered back to Mingaladen, ground crews rushed forward. They counted damage in silence. Some fighters looked shredded. One carried more than 100 bullet holes along its fuselage. Another had part of its tail structure missing. But they returned. Every pilot stepped out alive. Faces were drained and gray with exhaustion. Flight suits were soaked with sweat and streaked with oil. Cigarettes were lit with trembling fingers as they waited for confirmation reports. The numbers climbed steadily. 10, 15, 20. By day's end, the totals defied expectation. Over 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed. No American pilots lost. It did not seem statistically possible. In 2 days above Rangoon, Japanese forces had lost nearly 30 aircraft. The supposedly outdated P-40, flown by a collection of volunteers dismissed as mercenaries, had delivered one of the harshest defeats the Japanese Army Air Force had suffered to that point. The psychological shift was immediate. Pilots who had felt untouchable days earlier were now cautious. Reports circulated that the Americans possessed some new type of fighter. Others claimed the Americans were reckless to the point of insanity, charging head-on and refusing to break off. The shark mouth ceased being decoration. It became an emblem of a stubborn opponent. Inside the operations tent, celebration faded quickly. Chennault examined maintenance logs. Engines had been abused beyond normal limits during high-power climbs. Barrels were overheated and warped from sustained fire. Spare parts were nearly non-existent. Replacement pilots were not waiting in reserve. The Japanese had lost dozens of aircraft, but they had far more in storage. The Tigers had won engagements, yet attrition favored the larger force. Chennault understood the pattern. The enemy would return repeatedly, pressing until the P-40s were grounded or destroyed. He studied his pilots. In a week, they appeared years older. They had proven themselves, but endurance had limits. The shark mouths were operating on diminishing resources. The defense of Rangoon did not end the campaign. What it did accomplish was the destruction of a myth. The Japanese Air Force, once viewed as an unstoppable surge, had been checked by fighters many had considered scrap. There were no parades, only sustained effort. For the following 6 months, the American volunteer group fought under conditions that should have guaranteed collapse. Supply lines were fragile. Meals consisted largely of rice and whatever meat could be found locally. Fuel had to be strained through cloth to remove contamination. Mechanics became indispensable. They patched bullet holes with scrap metal. They salvaged components from wrecked aircraft in jungle clearings and installed them on others. The result was a fleet of patched machines, functional through improvisation rather than design. Pilots flew repeatedly, sometimes 3 or more sorties in a day. Illness did not always ground them. Dysentery and fever were endured in the cockpit. Yet victories continued. Reports reaching Washington seemed exaggerated because the ratios were so uneven. When the American Volunteer Group was officially dissolved in July 1942, its record stood at 296 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with 14 pilots lost in combat. Such a ratio defied conventional wartime expectations. They achieved it with a fighter labeled obsolete. They relied on methods that contradicted standard manuals. They did so under paint schemes some critics had mocked. The shark mouth became widely recognized, appearing in newspapers across the United States and Britain. It symbolized resistance more than style. Eventually, formal authority arrived. The United States Army Air Forces assumed control. Uniformed officers with regulations and procedures replaced the informal structure that had defined the Tigers. The volunteers, long hair, open collars, boots worn from jungle strips, were regarded as undisciplined. Orders to conform followed. Many declined. They had flown for Chennault, not for administrative routine. Some left entirely. Others transitioned into transport roles, flying supply routes over the Himalayas. Still, results could not be dismissed. The new commanders reviewed combat outcomes and studied the wreckage of Japanese aircraft scattered across Burmese terrain. They recognized the effectiveness of Chennault's approach. Without fanfare, American fighter doctrine shifted. Emphasis moved away from tight turning contests. Altitude and speed became primary tools. Boom and zoom entered standard practice in the Pacific. The P-40, once nearly discarded, proved essential in the early stages of the war. It held positions in North Africa, supported operations in the Soviet Union, and fought across the Pacific until newer aircraft like the Mustang and Hellcat arrived. It served as the protective shield during a period when more advanced weapons were still in development. Chennault did not boast. He remained in China and took command of the 14th Air Force. He expanded the principles first tested by the Flying Tigers. The shark mouth remained. The aggressive philosophy remained. By the time the conflict ended, Chennault's airmen had accounted for thousands of destroyed Japanese aircraft and ships. The officer who had once been pushed aside as outdated and partially deaf had demonstrated a clarity others lacked. Faced with a problem dismissed as unsolvable, heavy fighter against lighter, more agile opponent, he had found the solution in something simple: gravity. The P-40 Warhawk never earned the title of best fighter on paper. It did not dominate in speed. It did not climb higher than its rivals. It remained a blunt instrument, more truck than thoroughbred. But it was the right tool at the right moment. It was strong enough to absorb punishment. It was straightforward enough that mechanics could keep it flying with limited resources. And once those jagged white teeth were painted across its nose, it carried an edge that went beyond performance charts. The shark mouth did not improve horsepower or aerodynamics. It altered the mindset of the pilot inside. It gave him purpose. A young man from a farm town stepped into that cockpit and felt less like a driver of machinery and more like the handler of something dangerous. That spirit did not disappear with the war. At modern air shows, restored P-40s still taxi with their teeth gleaming, but the deeper inheritance lives elsewhere. Consider the A-10 Thunderbolt II, known as the Warhawk. It is not elegant. It is slow compared to sleek jets. It is heavily armored and built around a massive cannon. It is another flying brick, and often its nose carries the same shark mouth. A-10 pilots speak openly of the Flying Tigers. Their mission shares the same themes: low altitude, direct contact, resilience over refinement. They trust armor and determination more than grace. Over time, the shark mouth has become shorthand for those aircraft and crews who handle the harshest assignments, the unglamorous work that protects others. On paper, Japanese forces once held advantages in aircraft quality, training hours, and numbers. The Flying Tigers demonstrated that calculation can shift when tactics and mentality change. They accepted an aircraft others dismissed and rewrote the rules of engagement. Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, who had served with the group before earning fame in the Marine Corps, once described the P-40 as junk that would still bring you home. For a pilot, that was praise of the highest order. The fighter returned its crew safely when theory predicted failure. It carried them through concentrated gunfire and burning skies. It rattled and lacked elegance, yet it endured. When you see the familiar olive drab nose, red tongue, and white teeth, remember what it represented. Picture Jack Newkirk diving into a bomber formation. Picture Tex Hill accelerating head-on into superior numbers. Picture mechanics in Burmese mud repairing battle damage with scrap metal and improvised tools. Recall the winter of 1941, when events seemed to favor unstoppable momentum, and a small group of volunteers stood in its path with worn aircraft and stubborn resolve. Their stand did not end the war, but it altered its trajectory. Sometimes resolve outweighs equipment. If this account resonated with you, show your support so more of these overlooked battles continue to be told. Consider subscribing to follow future stories uncovered from the archives. Thank you for watching and for helping preserve these histories. We will meet again in the next story from the cockpit.